Next in our program, we have a producer panel on rebuilding the cow herd. This is going to be preceded by a short presentation from Dr. Jay Parsons from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Dr. Parsons is a professor in agricultural economics, specializing in farm and ranch management, decision analysis, risk management, and production system analysis. He teaches advanced farm management and linear programming and is part of an interdisciplinary research and extension team evaluating economical systems for integrated crop and livestock production in Nebraska. Dr. Parsons has almost 20 years of experience helping farmers and ranchers understand risk and emerging management tools. And then he's going to be doing a short presentation and introduce the panel to you. I'll bring up that presentation. Thank you, Jay. Let's see. I think we're on right here.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for having me here today. So I was instructed to give kind of a little short view of things that I think about when it comes to this rebuilding the herd topic, and then I'll turn it over to let our panelists each say a little bit on their perspectives. We'll have a nice discussion, I'm sure, because everybody's talking about the where we're at in terms of the cow population, right? Beef cows, historical lows, prices historically high. Everybody assumes we're going to rebuild it someplace at some point, and then we're all worried about how the market's going to react to all that stuff. So I'll start with just a little bit more about myself. I actually grew up about 45 minutes to the east of here, just across the border in Nebraska, and at that time a cattle and a wheat farm. My brother runs the place and since expanded it quite a bit in terms of the crops grown, but still has a pretty good sized cow herd there. So I have a Western Nebraska perspective, even though I'm currently based in Lincoln, and currently you can come on up, Connor. Late to the party here. Currently the director of our Center for Agricultural Profitability at UNL. So I'll say a little bit more about that here in a second and talk about one of the reports that we do that's relevant to our topic here today. But let me start with this quote here from Daryl Peel. Dr. Daryl Peel, how many of you read his stuff? I think most of us, at least in the ag econ world, we follow what Daryl says about the markets. And he's been saying this for quite some time. Although this quote is fairly fresh, I think this just came out maybe 10 days ago in one of the trade magazines. But basically, 3/4 of 225 has passed, and here we are with no solid indication of heifer retention. The only direct data we have is the mid-year cattle report, which showed the lowest beef replacement heifer inventory in the history of that particular data set. And that's the data set that is charted there, and it starts at the upper left in 2017 with about 4.7 million heifers in the beef herd intended as replacements. You see the downward slope over a period of years to 2023 where it stood at about 3.8 million, I believe. And then the gap, because this report wasn't put out in 2024, so technically we don't know if this is the lowest amount. I got to pick on him about that. We could have had a lower one last year and we just didn't know it. But this year it came in about 3.7 million. So there's no indication yet that people are retaining heifers and looking to rebuild the herd. And we're looking at the prices and wondering, what's going on there. Of course, that big gap there from 21 to 23, in this part of the world, and of course over in Nebraska, we had a huge drought, right? People were depopulated quite a bit because of that. And we've seen this before, right? 2012 wasn't all that long ago. And then we were wondering how quick or how soon are we going to rebuild the herd? And if you've been keeping up with the trade magazines lately, you've seen a few people start to creep in language like it's going to be a slow rebuild. I'm not convinced of that yet, but we do know that it's slow taking off, at least at this point. Okay, so what's some of the things that go into that? Heifer development, which I know some of us are going to talk about here, that in terms of what goes into that and the costs that go into that. And what's really one of the big factors here is that first one on there, which is that heifer calf value. So if you're doing your own heifer replacement program in your herd, you've been doing this stuff for a long time. The question on rebuilding is, do you want to hold back more calves? And right now, that heifer calf value is pretty dang high, and that opportunity cost attached to that is pretty high. And then there's the risk aspect of what's going to happen to the market. Are you going to get paid back for that investment in that heifer calf? And then you had the variable costs attached to actually producing the heifer, taking her from off the cow into a bred heifer entering the herd, and then any additional fixed costs that go with your heifer development program, which if you already have one, those are already there. But just to look at that heifer calf value, these are numbers from a year ago at this time in a ranch practicum. A year ago at this time in a ranch practicum, that heifer calf in Nebraska at least was bringing about 280 a hundredweight. So about a $1,500 calf. So you're foregoing that sale to save her back to breed her and increase the number of bred heifers coming into your herd, to increase the number of cows that you have. At that time, I was looking at about 8% interest on operating notes. So that translates into $1,600 to $1,700, just the value of that calf, okay? This year, that number's gone up quite a bit, 2025. I put in 380, that's pretty conservative. I think we're at 4.25 for steers, so maybe not too bad. There's a pretty big basis there between steers and heifers right now. But about, you look at that number, you're well up over $2,000 in that calf now. I dropped the interest rate down to 7%, but you're looking at about a $600 larger investment in that calf at this point to retain her and breed her and get her back in the herd. I just put in rough numbers for the other stuff in terms of those actual costs that go into that. And these would be, in the heifer breeding program, you're going to have similar costs as your cow costs and so on. And I know Brandon from LMIC is going to talk a little bit more about that after lunch and some more details. I'm just using rough numbers here. But $500 in feed, $150 labor, veterinary breeding costs, depending on your situation. So those numbers may be cash out of pocket. Some of them may be your time and et cetera. And then I threw in $50 for that overhead cost. But you're looking at roughly, close to $3,000. Okay, and most of that is tied up in that actual calf itself, holding it back and not selling it as a calf. So what does that translate in terms of what you need to get back? Okay. Well, if you've taken out a loan, you're familiar with the amortization schedule. So if you take a $3,000 loan, what kind of payments do you got to make to get the money back? That's all I'm doing here. What are the assumptions that you have? I put in here 7% interest in 7 years. What does that mean? I'm assuming I'm going to get 7 years of productive life out of this cow, 7 calves coming off of her, okay, on average. 7% interest, that means I need to clear $557 a year for 7 years to recoup that $3,000 investment. Okay, that's a pretty good profit margin. We have that right now, most likely. The question is that going to hold for 7 years? And if it's not, what's that going to look like? Okay, and then am I going to get 7 calves on average out of my cows? Okay, so that's the way that would translate into that dollar figure that you're looking for, and that's some of that hesitancy as we look forward and see what the market's actually going to do. Okay, this is a table with that required annual net returns for break even. You see the 557 there in the middle? That was with my assumption of a $3,000 animal and 7 years of useful life. Yeah, how's that go? Well, if you go up to a 4,000, you're paying 4,000, you get another almost $200 to that in terms of what you need in annual returns from that. If you get more calves out of it, of course, the need for each year goes down slightly, $50, $40, but you see that's diminishing because those later calves that you get, right, that's further down the line, so that's worth less in today's dollars. But one of the big things is if you don't get 7 calves, you go back up that $3,000 column, you can see very quickly you need a lot higher returns per year to recoup that cost. Okay, so if you're only getting 5 calves out of it, you're looking at about needing close to $200 more a year there, just out of that. So that's one perspective of it. That's saying, what is this animal costing you? What do you need to get back on an annual basis to do that? So that would be the net returns in terms of what you get off of that for revenue, minus those costs of actually producing it. Okay, I mentioned our Center for Ag Profitability. Each fall we put out a replacement heifer forecast. And that QR code up there, if you're interested, you can scan that and that'll take you to the page that has this webinar on it. You see the people listed there. These are all Members of our center that are out at our North Platte Center, the West Central Research Extension and Education Center, so Shannon Sand, Randy Sater, and Matt Stockton, they presented this webinar a couple weeks ago, and the recording is up there for you along with all the slides, and I just captured kind of the take-home slide here on this screen. But they got a lot of other information and a report that says how all that stuff was calculated. Now, they took the other direction to it. They basically took a look at what we have for prices and costs for projected revenues and projected costs. They used the data out of Texas A&M, and they worked through a stochastic study of that, and then they basically average that out and say, what should we be willing to pay today for a heifer? Okay, so they're looking at what the break-even price of the heifer should be, and these are the numbers here that they come up with. So that 7 years I had would be roughly a 14% coal rate. If you go across that, I'm pretty close to that medium cost number and the numbers that I have assumed. But obviously, if you have a low coal rate, so they produce a large number of calves, you have a low annual cost in your cow herd of about $1,000, you can afford to pay up to $3,700. That's your break-even price, okay? Anything above that, odds are you're not gonna make money off of that animal, okay? And they also, I think it's on one of their slides actually, where they did a $4,000 heifer, and in that low-cost 14% coal rate, it was over 50% of the time you're not gonna get that money back, okay? Or it's right at 50-50. But the best case scenario, or worst case scenario, I should say, is down if you have a high cost herd at a very high coal rate, then you shouldn't pay over $1,680 per heifer, or you're not gonna make money off that heifer over its lifespan, okay, on average. So like I said, the report's up there, the full webinar's up there, and they got more detail. But the bottom line is that this is a tough decision, and managing those investment costs on those replacement heifers when you're building up your herd is super important for your long-term profitability. But obviously, it's more than just what the animal actually costs you that's important. It's got to be a productive animal, okay? So you don't want to cut corners and buy in animals or save back animals that aren't going to be productive for you. Because at the end of the day, you need to get increased performance, you need to get longevity, you need to get productivity out of those animals, okay? So you're constantly balancing that, and there's also obviously a lot of risk involved that's out of your control in terms of the marketplace, how quick the herd builds on its own, and so on and so forth, and how all that impacts you. So the bottom line is it's not a trivial decision. It's a very complex decision, and it's a very important one in terms of how you go about doing it. Okay. So that's what I have on there. There's my contact information. I'll be around the rest of the day if you want to talk, and feel free to go to our website and check out some of the materials that we have on that. And I hope our panelists are ready to talk. You guys ready to talk? Okay. Well, all right, each of our panelists are here, and I know Connor Beeler from our extension group, so he's right here on my left. So what I'd like for you guys to each is give your perspective on this question, you know, what you're bringing to it in terms of, I know you do the heifer development program, Connor, and I don't know how much detail you want to go to on that. And yeah, and then we'll just see where the conversation goes after that. So Connor Beeler, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, go ahead first.
All right, yeah, as Jay said, I'm with UNL. I serve as a regional extension educator, and as a part of that role, with my counterpart here at the other end of the table, a few years ago, we decided to start the Great Plains Heifer Development Center up at the Haskell Ag Lab. And as Jay had mentioned, you know, this is a very complex thing, and I think he did a nice job of summarizing it on the front end. But I'm looking forward to the conversation that we can have once we open the floor up to the crowd.
JD's going to give us a northern Wyoming perspective, right? Padlock ranch?
So we're a large cow-calf operation that runs up on the northern Wyoming, southern Montana border. You know, in our situation, our heifer development's organic. You know, we're just selecting heifers out of our herd. You know, a lot of what we're going to be wrestling with is, are you willing to give up some of the short-term profitability and profit-taking right now to build your cow herd? You know. So.
Yeah. Good morning, James Sewell Ranching. We run on about 6 ranches in Carbon County. Decent number of cows, but primarily a stocker program. And we are first generation in our business, so we don't have 120 years of history, and I don't have to worry about what my dad thinks about what we should do. But we also have to pay leases everywhere we go. So got a cash flow. I think a couple things that are going to be missed in a lot of these conversations that really drive it is U.S. tax policy is going to accelerate heifer retention a lot more than maybe is accounted for. And then the other thing I think is, we turn out several thousand stockers a year in Carbon County, mostly sourced in western Nebraska and Wyoming. The margin on those is zero right now because they're mostly going to Oklahoma, to wheat and stuff. And there is a much better margin in breeding and keeping or selling bred heifers than there is in running traditional stockers. So it's not that hard to go from spaying several thousand heifers to breeding a portion of those, and the margins look way better. And so I think a margin operator like myself, compared to a normal cow-calf person, can make that switch much faster than you would think was going to happen.
Yeah. Thanks for that perspective. Kieran.
Yeah, my name's Kieran Brandt. I'm heavily involved in the Great Plains Heifer Development Center with Connor Beeler down here on the other end. I'm a product of Laramie County, graduated from Central High School here. Got my start in agriculture within the Cheyenne FFA system, so it's good to be back. I wear a little bit of two hats, and I'll kind of talk about that from that perspective today. I'm trained as a reproductive physiologist, very passionate about heifer development, and I think that's one message that's going to come through pretty clear from everyone up here is that this is a very complicated segment of the industry, and I think doing your due diligence and remaining flexible and not becoming so caught in traditional ways and methodologies of thinking is gonna pay dividends as we go through this. I definitely left my crystal ball at the hotel earlier, so if anyone brought theirs that they could loan me, I'd sure appreciate it. The other side of that, I now am a professional services technician for Transova Genetics, so largely involved in the embryo production and implantation side of things across the Dakotas and Nebraska. And so, I have a little bit of a unique perspective as from that side of things. So looking forward to it. I'm glad to be here.
Okay, we're gonna, I got a few questions to ask him, but I'd like to start with seeing if anybody in the audience has a question, because we want to get questions from the audience in terms of this rebuilding the herd, I should say concept, issue. Are there any questions from the audience to start us off? Okay, well, all right, well, be thinking of them, because I'm going to come out and force you guys to come up with some good questions. So let me start with my question in terms of if you were talking to a 30-something-year-old producer that was looking to basically increase their herd, given the fact that we have good prices, they have good grass, and so on and so forth, what would be the number one thing you would tell them to make sure that they get correct? Connor, you want to go first?
I think first off, the thing you need to look at is simply just the economics, and I think that's what any one of us up here would tell you. From my perspective, I think you want to make sure that you're purchasing the right genetics that meet your marketing goals as well. Something that fits your environment and, using bulls that fit your environment. As a part of the Heifer Development Center, one thing we've really liked to do on heifers is use just proven high accuracy bulls once it comes time to breed them. And we also have a bit of a kind of a culling protocol within what we've kind of determined. And maybe I'll let Kieran kind of hone in on this a little bit more since it's his brainchild. But really the main thing is identifying those small pelvises. You don't have to use a rice pelvimeter. Just having, whenever you sleeve your cattle, if you're doing repro track scores or anything like that, at that point in time, just identify those narrower pelvises, and then also disposition, because they're going to be around, that also I think depends on who you are and your operation. as far as docility. And then the final one is how quickly they get bred. You know, when we're AI in 2 rounds there, I know that's definitely not a traditional system that is going to be seen within production. But, you know, we kind of found this year that we did have a little bit of a lower breeding rate with that second round of AI. And is that an issue with those cattle? Is it the timing? What else is going on there that we can't particularly figure out at that point in time?
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to come back to you two. Karen, did you want to go ahead and add your perspective?
You know, I think, especially at the Great Plains Heifer Development Center, you know, it's primarily just holding those heifers accountable. That's something that we really emphasize. And, you know, this is some strategies that have come firsthand from Trey Patterson at the Padlock Ranch. So it's not like this is new information. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to promote, you know, first and foremost, weaning valuable calves off of your first calf heifers. And, you know, in reference to what Connor was mentioning, we've embraced kind of a 3-strike policy, identifying the percentage, whether that's, you know, the bottom third, the bottom 25% of your smallest pelvis animals, setting them up in a position where you can identify which of those animals don't get bred. Primarily first one round of AI, which is going to be largely more applicable to the, you know, the broader sector. Breed those heifers once, then kick them out. But being able to identify which ones actually took to that AI. And then, you know, the third strike would be any calving difficulties in that first calving event. In our mind, that disqualifies a heifer from, you know, we've already, as Jay outlined, we've already outlined, you know, a pretty steep uphill battle for a female to have to go on and be productive in the cow herd, and she's going to have to hold her own for a long period of time and stay productive. And a question that jumped into my mind as he was introing some of this is, how many of us are set up to evaluate the average age of our cow herd, and how many of us are set up to have females that are going to be producing those 7th and 8th calves, where we have the opportunity to really break into profitability. So, you know, I think you can, the sooner that you can identify that and identify females that are going to be active candidates to do that well and get rid of the ones that are not, the better off you're going to be in the long term.
Yeah, so productivity obviously is a big deal, and having that room to make that selection, actually hold back more than you need, so you can actually have that decision on which ones to keep, is even harder when we start talking about what the value of that calf is, right? So we get the perspective of that decision. JD, again, back to the question, it was what if 30-some-year-old was looking to build their herd, what would be one thing you'd tell them to make sure they get right?
Well, I think one of the things you'd want to do first off really is evaluate, you know, do you have the opportunity to grow in your operation? Because I think for a lot of us, you really got to look at your enterprise mix and do you have the room for growth in your operation? You know, because I don't know how it is out in all you folks' country, but you know, leases are hard to come by where we're at. We run on a lot of deeded ground, but we also run on a lot of leased ground, and so that's one of the first things I'm looking at is there that opportunity? You know, second thing is, you know, you need to select for an animal that fits your operation, right? You know, I mean, most of us, you know, our heifer selection is probably pretty rudimentary. We're kind of selecting out of the middle of our heifer crop, right? We're kind of, you know, we're sorting off our smalls, sorting off the really big horsey kind of cattle that don't fit, and then we're breeding most of those and you know, seeing what breeds up in our season. But one of the things I think you want to really be thinking about too, for you folks that are maybe looking to purchase these expensive, you know, replacement heifers, if you're looking at growth, is what does that increase in cow depreciation cost do to your overall profitability, not just this year, but moving forward in the next 5 or 6 years? Because, you know, if you're going to go buy that $4,000 bred heifer, and you know, you think about what that does to Jack and your cow depreciation cost, that may have a lot to do with your profitability as you move into these lower price cycles that we're going to see, you know, coming out of this high market right now.
Very good. James?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, something that if you're already in the business, I'm assuming that, right? So you've made a lot of money selling your steer calves potentially, and you're trying to decide what to do with heifers or cows. Is keeping that money together and not giving it back. So, you know, you could sell heifer calves, defer the income till 26 with a variety of ways, or think about if there's an option to keep some of those because maybe you don't owe the bank operating money now, but you also don't want to give it to Uncle Sam. So if you're not taking that revenue in 2025, thinking of maybe AI around in the feedlot, and I have just run cattle in the feedlot in the summer before and made money, to grow. Right now that might not happen, but trying to look at enterprise analysis, if there's something that's got a positive economic basis, like it looks like it's got a good margin, and then maybe defer some of your tax liability. One of the things I see as young people that want to grow too, those cows look stupid expensive at $4,000. Well, Section 179 depreciation, you can fully depreciate a heifer calf, a bred heifer, a cow right now. And so whatever you spend, if you're in a 25% tax bracket and you spend $4,000 on a cow, that cow really costs you $3,000. And so that changes the math quite a bit on the slide. And so just working, there's a lot of us that have need for tax advice that we didn't have maybe 5 years ago. And it's a good issue.
Yeah, so you mentioned in your opening remarks about the tax issue. Is that what you were getting at? Is that in terms of the expansion of the herd?
Yeah, so there's a really incentive because of, well, obviously what just happened in the One Beautiful Bill. It doubled the amount that you can fully depreciate with Section 179. But if you buy an animal this year for breeding purposes, up to $2.5 million worth of that, you can fully expense that animal against this year's cost. It can be a heifer calf, a bred heifer, a cow, doesn't matter. The other thing I talked to like Kyle Kilty, if you're selling a heifer calf, that's ordinary income. If you sell her as a bred heifer a February and a half from now, that's a capital gain that's maxed out at 20% instead of maybe 15%. And we're still probably going to be at a good place in the cattle market. So it's thinking first what makes economic sense, and two, how to keep most of that money in your pocket instead of giving it back to the government. Like you can operate with that money for the next 2 years instead of letting Uncle Sam operate with it.
I appreciate that point greatly because we don't want to minimize our taxes, right? But we do want to optimize them, right, over a period of years and taking advantage of different tax rules that are in place and just understanding how they actually affect your income, right, over time. So I teach the advanced farm management class at UNL, and so we analyze that decision from the perspective of buying equipment. You're financing it or not financing it, and then when you take into account the actual capital gains issue, if you sell an old piece of equipment that's fully depreciated and so on, and it's interesting. Students, I know from my perspective, young people don't really think about those things, okay, and it could make a big difference on the actual decision. So thanks for that perspective. I have one other question before I start pestering the audience and see what we got out there for burning questions, because I know we do have some, and that's the risk. I do a lot with risk management and stuff. From the perspective of rebuilding the herd, and this question of rebuilding the herd, what is the primary risk that you would want to address or try to address with a control that you could see that you could actually use, right? Because some of these things are out of your control. But what are one of the things that would keep you up at night or make you think this through deeply? Who wants to go first? I've been picking on Connor. James.
So I think one thing that JD talked about is cow depreciation. I think going into this risk management, and we know we're kind of at the top of the cycle. Like if I was keeping heifers or thinking about keeping heifers, I would have an exit strategy within 2 years on those. I would not think about getting paid off in 7 calves. That is not going to happen. You'll be very disappointed, I think, historically, at the top of the cycle, keeping anything. Yeah. But if you have a fairly quick couple-year exit strategy, you might be less disappointed with whatever you decide to keep as far as selling that animal.
Good piece of advice. And exit strategies could take on a number of different forms, right? Selling a bred cow that's got 2 calves history could be one of your exit strategies.
I think, today is just such a volatile time, and this kind of circles back to, I am a 30-year-old young producer, and, it's frankly, it's terrifying. I'm not going to lie to you guys. It's nerve-wracking, and that is a big part of it is the volatility and not knowing what to happen, and just trying to pace and keep track and not get so starstruck with high sale averages, big price tags at the sale barn. It's important to keep it realistic. I think it also depends on where you're at and who you have in your corner and who you have on your management team that's helping you make these decisions. a girl that was helping me out the other day when we were making embryos asked me, if she should go buy some bred cows and get into the cattle market. And I said, she has, very little infrastructure. And I said, I'd maybe wait a couple years. Let's try to think about this a little bit more organically and how we can, start this from an economically sound background. But, I also think, just given what we've seen in the last few years, we probably do have, and I don't want to, please nobody take me to school for this, but I think we might have finally gotten to a place just with inflation and some of the things that have caught up in other parts of the world where we might have a little bit of downside protection. I mean, I know I'm not nearly the most seasoned person in the room, but I remember 10 years ago getting into this as a young kid, and prices are significantly more elevated than they were even then. And I hope that, if anything, we've recognized the importance of the U.S. beef industry, where we can put things in place to at least offer us a softer landing as we approach a more normal cattle cycle.
Thanks, good. JD?
Yeah, and I just think the biggest thing is you got to know your costs, right? Because in my mind, it's all about cost management. One of the biggest drivers for growth is dilution of your overhead costs, for a lot of us. I mean, especially in big, extensive systems, and understanding, how those margins play into your profitability. We're a big, extensive system. We beat the industry average as far as like our heifer development cost to book a bred heifer into our cow herd. But boy, we're very aware that as these, our operating costs have continued to increase over the last few years. So even though we're seeing these record prices, our margins, I wouldn't say this year, but over the last 3 or 4 years have actually been smaller than they were the last time we saw one of these big run-ups. So I think the big thing is don't be going and getting giddy about this thing just because of where you see these current price structures.
Good. Connor?
Looks like I'm the one that gets to tie all this together. I think they all did a great job of listing all the things, on the economic side. I would say kind of one of the most important things that I would hone in on is the cost of development. We're not getting more pastures, unfortunately. Whenever we saw $7 corn, we now see a lot of 5-strand barbed wire fence with rows through it. Looking at our alternative systems, I know there's data out there that suggests that developing heifers in lots isn't maybe going to be the best for longevity. So that's something to take into consideration. But also, what are your costs and how can you do it effectively and do that without cutting corners? I think that's the most important thing is, trying to do it inexpensively and not cheap.
Thanks. Questions from the audience or our panelists?
Besides the rebuilding of a herd, what about smaller producers that are trying to develop their herd and build it? Economically, what's the best choices to make in that aspect?
I'll give the candid repro answer off the bat is, I'm from here. I currently live in northeast South Dakota, and one of the things that bothers me about where I live most is that the cattle in that part of the world can get away with a lot because they don't have to work that hard compared to where I grew up. So something I like to focus on is, not crutching your cattle up too much with, external feed. There's nothing wrong with supplementing feed when it's cheap, but it's not always cheap, and establishing a cattle herd that requires supplementation at a high level is a dangerous game. So yeah, putting yourself in a position to gather high quality reproductive data, let the performance of those cows speak for itself, and really hone in on that, and don't make excuses for the ones that aren't meeting that standard.
Okay. Any other panelists want to address that for a small person starting out?
Yeah, I'd say, I said we're first generation. We didn't don't go in too quickly trying to make a whole living on your cow herd. Like, it's okay if it's a sideline deal. If you look at the people that have been presidents of Wyoming stock growers through the years, I know there's a lot of them that have significant side businesses, and there's no shame in that. So if they have to do that or have chosen to do that, there is no shame in a small person thinking it's a pride thing to think you got to make all your money on cows. I certainly don't, still to this day. And having diverse sources of income, so if cows don't have to pay your whole bill. The other thing, my son Cody right there says, don't make weak-willed cows. Back to your point. Don't be feeding them all the time. We calve heifers. I send them to Sam List back there. It's close to calving time. Everybody wants to bring their heifers to the barn. We send those to a 12,000 acre pasture. Like, let them be cows. Like this, let them be moderate size, let them be cows. They will be able to survive. They'll be low input. Handing them everything is a good way to ruin them. And it's easy when you're small to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd probably parrot a little bit of what James is saying there. You know, I think it's that, initially everybody wants to get to a size where they can quit that off ranch job to just be in the cow business. But, being realistic about that may be the thing that gives you that opportunity to keep growing over there on the side, where you can take some of this profit that you're making on these cows and keep reinvesting it into that cow herd so that you can grow that cow herd. But yeah, I can't say that enough either. Just don't baby your cows. If you want a cow to fit your system, you've got to treat her like she's just going to have to live there and work for you. I think a lot of folks tend to want to, and I love our industry partners, but everybody wants to sell you a supplement or lick tubs and all those things like that. And I'm not against strategic supplementation, but make sure you've got a cow that fits your system that you're not having to prop up.
Some good advice, Aaron. My only advice was buy low and sell high, but that's a little... But I do want to put some light on that in terms of the diversification. One of the aspects of having a diversified operation or diversified sources of income is you do put yourself in position to sometimes expand when maybe the profit margin isn't there in cattle. So you actually can take advantage of that and maybe resist the temptation to buy a bunch of cattle when it's high. But anyway, that's just a comment. All right, you're up next.
On the idea of buy low, sell high, what is going to be the effect of beef on dairy? We've seen the effect of steers in a situation now. If you're selling heifers for $2,500 a piece and can buy a half Holstein for $1,500, why wouldn't you do that now?
Anybody want to comment on that, Kieran?
I would say that, in light of current events, I maybe have not always been the most outright advocate of beef on dairy, but I will say that a sustainably sourced domestic high quality beef supply is never gonna be a bad thing in my mind, and there's nothing wrong with the guys on the dairy side trying to capitalize on what the success we're seeing on the other side of things. It's not something that me saying is good or bad is going to have any kind of an impact. It's here to stay as long as I can see. On the flip side of that, I'll ask you the question. What's to prevent those guys from just putting in a full beef embryo into those Holsteins and having a full beef calf that is just raised under a unique, hand-reared scenario, and then becomes an early weaned beef calf that just enters the feeding stage at 60 to 90 days of age. And I'll say that that's happening too, and it's happening at a very rapid rate. That's the thing about the dairy industry, is they are the first to embrace new technologies and emerging concepts and go into them full tilt. So you'll see that time and time again. We work with a lot of great dairy producers and seeing a lot of growth on that side from not even just beef on dairy or full beef in dairy cows, but the future of the dairy industry looks pretty good too. So. I won't get too far down that rabbit hole, but I think the future looks good, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for crossover and collaboration, especially when we start trying to identify ways to get more heifer calves into potentially some some uteruses where we could capitalize on them. Off the top of my head, I didn't plan on softballing that in here, but that would be a good way to free up some space and kind of rob Peter to pay Paul, is to put a full beef dairy or a full beef embryo into a dairy critter and then buy back that replacement heifer as a way to jumpstart some heifer retention when we get down that way, when it becomes a little bit more affordable maybe.
You mentioned quite a bit about cow depreciation. Be interested to hear your thoughts on merchandising older bred cows while they're high, and then trading that bred cow for a calf or a heifer yearling that you could then breed.
I don't think that's a bad strategy right now, as long as you are in a position where you feel like your profitability is such that that you don't need to sell those heifers. To go ahead and sell some short-term cows, short-term bred cows, and retaining more heifers, into your system just to youthen your cow herd up. Probably sets you up for some longevity right now, and especially, you think about right now you're getting a premium on those old short-term cows. I think that's the one thing we're all blessed with right now, is depending on what your salvage cost is on a cow, and everybody's book cost is a little different that way. We're all really seeing capital gains on these cull cows that we're selling right now. So I think that adding value to some of those what would traditionally be cull cows in your herd, and maybe using that as an opportunity to retain more heifer calves, is maybe a solid strategy for some folks.
So, any other panelists want to comment on that? Okay, thanks.
So James had talked about, it's really easy to pivot and throw a bull on some heifers rather than just run her as a stalker. But then Connor had also talked about, keeping your quality genetics. So how do we balance growing the cow herd and keeping those genetics? If you can just pivot so easily and gain females, are we actually, causing detriment to the genetics in the national beef herd?
I mentioned that, so I'll address it. I think if I sort through 3,000 or 4,000 stalker heifers, black ones, and if you think you have better cows than that make more money than a moderate-sized cow, I'd be a little surprised if I couldn't sort, 20% of that. The other thing is, mentioned earlier, why don't you just, if you're brave enough and willing to spend some money on genomic testing, that's an option. Sometimes our cows aren't quite as good as we think they are.
Yeah, personal, everybody loves to think that they have the eye, and we all are great evaluators of cattle in this room, but sometimes removing that portion of the equation can be rather enlightening, and especially when you're talking about it from the flexibility of, using it as a pivot and staying flexible. Not dumping a lot of feed into those heifers and letting the ones that get bred, and remaining flexible on the ones that don't, and having a downstream option to market those heifers at an affordable price too. It just it lends credence into just remaining flexible and not thinking you have all the answers, and sometimes just setting yourself up to be surprised and have success that way.
Yeah, and I think about some of what Bert Teichert always said, about why don't you just go ahead and expose all your heifers, and the best cow to have is the one that breeds up and stays in your system, right? And so maybe let environment sort on that, and there's always a market for good quality open heifers to go on feed in the fall. So.
With the times that we're in, we now have a chance to fine-tune our cow herd. So as we're looking at rebuilding, what are some technologies that are available now that you guys have utilized or seen others utilize that will help them provide a more consistent quality product? Because that's what we've got to do to be competitive with some of the other things coming on. So if you could share your insights or experiences on that in terms of rebuilding, I'd appreciate that.
Well, I'll just jump in quick and offer, just in the terms of what me and Connor are working on specifically at the Heifer Development Center. It's something you see every day on the dairy side of things, custom heifer development. And basically the way it was penciled out way back when, even on the beef side, is every heifer that we're developing before you is, you know, about 6/10, 2/3 of a cow that could be grazing at your place due to the grass that heifer's not eating anymore. So being flexible about an option like that may have, you know, gone away in recent years for whatever reason that may be. Just, you know, there used to be some really great ones in the state of Nebraska, and there's still great heifer development programs all over the country. And we'd love to see that become something that's more readily capitalized on to, you know, especially as we start thinking about expanding and keeping good productive cows at home grazing and raising calves and making everybody money, and, you know, trying to develop the heifer side of it as a business to incorporate some of those other technologies like genomic selection and just some of the older school measurements that we take, you know, frame score, some things like that. Whatever, custom tailoring things to capture meaningful and useful data.
I'll just say, just to piggyback off of Kieran, you know, I do think that outsourcing it is a good potential option as we go forward and we look to rebuild. As far as technology goes, you know, we've been doing genomic testing for quite some time, but we're starting to see it become more popular in commercial herds, and you know, I'm starting to work with more producers who are using that top to bottom on all of their heifers. Even the ones that they might do a sort or two prior to genomic testing, but before those heifers are exposed, they are taking those genomics tests at that point in time. So I think, you know, as we continue to build those databases and continue to develop and advance in that direction, I think genomics testing is probably going to be the number one tool going forward as we rebuild.
Good afternoon. I guess my question is, in your real world development of your heifers, how you guys calculate the length of the life of that heifer in your cow herd. Because I know we were looking over here on the slides at keeping them 5 to 7 to 10 years. Every first calf heifer that doesn't rebreed, you have to have a 10-year-old cow to balance that out. And so from everything I've ever calculated, they really stay in there like 3 to 4 years. And I'm just wondering if that's what you guys see, because for the kids that are trying to build these heifers, that are looking at the slides thinking they can get 7, 8 calves out of each of these cows. And if you live in Nebraska and you're letting them do on their own, or wherever you're at, a lot of those cows that come off of corn stalks that are eating sand and corn, they don't have teeth at 8 years old. And so, I mean, I don't know what you guys are seeing, and you're talking about turning them out on 12,000 acres and letting them figure it out. That's just gonna take them out sooner. So I'm not sure that the slides that we looked at, no offense to anybody, I'm not sure in a real world situation that you're ever gonna get 6 calves to pay for a $4,000 heifer.
I like that question. This isn't crop insurance, right? You don't get to plug in the county average for the zeros. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I think 5 years is probably a more realistic number to use. You know, I think about us, you know, in big extensive, you know, we've got 11,000 plus cows, and as I, you know, look at, and we're collecting age data, so we know our average cow age, and as I looked at the number of 12 and 13-year-old cows that we had to cull this year, there was only about, you know, 500 of those on the books, right? And so every year, you know, we're bringing somewhere from 1,700 to 2,000 replacement heifers, you know, into our system. So, you know, I think one of the most dangerous things you could do right now with an expensive heifer is go and assume that she's going to have more productive life than she's going to have. You want to get your cost recovery a little closer than that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, industry average, if you cold opens and dries and bad issues, yeah, you're probably whatever your cull rate is, probably 4 years or 5. Take your cull rate, if it's 15 or 20%, until you get down to 50, whatever that is, 0.85 times 4 times or so is about it. That's why I mentioned earlier about an exit strategy on these high dollar animals pretty soon. One thing right now, if you take a $4,000 bred heifer and she's open next year, but she's going to have a calf, she's open next year, okay? Right now, if you look at Torrington, dry, an open 2-year-old is worth $3,000. So you've lost $1,000. You had a $2,000 calf. You're probably still going to be all right, and that's just on your open ones. And so in that short term, it's still not bad. But yeah, thinking you're going to be 7-8 years is a fool's errand. Like, and you're going to be in a declining market. I did an evaluation for a ranch that we lease much cows from and run, and I assumed over the next 5 years a 10% decrease in price of calf and cow and salvage value of cow every year to see what the economics of that are. And it says don't buy cows right now. Now, but put that in, like, I think an evaluation that you do should assume a declining market, and just what you said, they're going to turn out a lot quicker than that if you cull dries.
Yeah.
And opens.
And be mean to your heifers. I mean, the harder you can be on your heifers, a mentor to me once said that if you're not prepared to have 30% of your replacement heifers come up open, then you're not pushing them hard enough. If you think that the reproductive efficiency of your cow herd is lacking, a lowly heritable trait that occurs over several seasons like reproduction, the only way to do it is to put the screws to them and make them work. And if you do that to a young animal, if you're hard on your 2-year-olds, by the time they're 3, 4s, and 5s, a lot of that will work itself out and they will be a more productive cow.
Anything else? Okay, I'm going to ask a question now, and if anybody else has anything, make sure you raise your hand, and I'll come to you because we have time for a couple of more. What are the, we talk about how long they last in the herd, or whatever the question may be, weaning weights, whatever. What are the key metrics that you use to measure whether it's a good cow? How do you know you're making progress? It maybe seems simple, but it's nice to share what you actually look at for numbers at the point of actually just figuring out averages or whatever it is. What are the key things that you would point out?
I would say one of the things that I would do first is what's your average cow weight? Stocking rate over the long term is going to make the most difference to profit on your ranch. And so we saw that earlier. If big cows don't wean more calves, pounds of calf, this might be a time not only selling the older cows, but selling your bigger cows. Like if you could sell your 1,400 pound cows right now, they're going to sell at a premium, and keep your moderate sized cows and maybe your moderate sized heifers, like not only getting younger, but you can run more cows on your same ranch and not have to lease another ranch if you get rid of those big ones right now while they're worth a bunch of money.
Yeah, and I think James is right there. We're blessed that we have the opportunity to graze a lot of cows out in our system, winter cows out with minimal supplementation, and that's the one deal is maybe this is a good time to be hard on those cows that don't fit your system, because we've all got those thins that we cut back that won't winter out, and if you look at a lot of those are your big framier kind of cows that they maybe just don't fit a low input system, so now's the time to maybe capitalize on some of those, but focus on your cow age. I think that's a big deal. That's going to tell you a lot about what your longevity is looking like in your herd, unless you've put some external pressure on that by being intentional about, culling a little deeper because perhaps your breed ups were good one year or something like that, so.
Only thing I just made me think when I used to be at the Deseret in Utah, that the counterpoint to selling those old 12 and 13-year-old cows that made it on your ranch is maybe you ought to raise bulls out of those. Maybe you ought to test the progeny.
Or flush embryos out of them.
Oh, yeah, whatever you got to do. Maybe those are the ones you should keep and raise bulls and not have to go buy seed stock bulls.
Yeah, if that was going to be your super cow herd, that'd probably be a good herd to be raising those out of. So.
Karen, were you going to say something? Or? No, I'm good. Okay. Connor, you got anything to add? Okay.
So I'm all for not crutching cows, not putting a whole lot underneath them, because when you do, you create an animal that's not going to further suit your environment. You lose her even quicker than that. Call it 4 or 5 year or the 7-year mark. She's gone way before then. So that leaves the one problem of having a lot of culls if you're using a strategy where you're pushing your heifers hard. So you create really good heifers, but you have the ones that fell out. And I'm just curious to hear your guys' thoughts on an effective strategy for marketing animals that didn't fit your program so you can capitalize on what you already have. It's just not fitting with what you want further down the road.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. We rebreed a lot of our cull cows, right? They don't fit our system for whatever reason. They fell out of our calving cycle. And we're always looking for opportunities to add value to a cull cow. Gosh, when James was at the TA, we sold a lot of what we would call summer calvers to James because they fit his system. They were moving out of our system. It was a good relationship, So that's one of our biggest strategies is always look to try to add value above way up value to a cull cow, if you have the ability and the feed resource to be able to do that. Now if you're going to do that, you're going to have to have some sort of supplemental feeding, something where you can supplement some energy to have those cows cycle and breed in those less optimal times like that. But I think it's, especially right now when corn's cheap and things like that, I think it's a pretty good strategy.
Other thoughts from anybody? Okay, any of the last questions from the audience? I'm smelling lunch, so my stomach's starting to growl. But any last questions from the audience? You got one?
I'm not sure I have a question so much as comments, but the title of this segment is supposed to be Rebuilding the Cow Herd. To me, the single biggest driver towards rebuilding a cow herd will be a confidence in a good future market. You guys seem pretty pessimistic. I guess I have a little more optimism in it, just based on cow numbers, continual lower heifer retention. Inflation is through the roof, expenses through the roof. I'm going to keep some heifers.
Okay, thanks. Anybody want to add to that, Kieran?
Well, I think that's, everybody's searching for optimism in the current environment. The little bit of heifer retention that we've seen has been from, at least from the figures that I've seen, has been, from larger outfits that can afford to swallow that loss in the short term and kind of, space it out to the next season like we were talking about. And the hope is that optimism grows and that, that catches on with some of the smaller folks on down, and it looks a little bit more, it looks like a glowing ember starting to turn into a little bit of a flame, and we can see some moving, some movement in that direction. I think something that maybe didn't get talked about is, Connor and I are over East River, in the Dakotas and Nebraska, and there's going to be lots of regional components to this. Being opportunistic where you're at, maybe not necessarily listening to the smoke from the broader market, and just having a good button on your finances and making a decision that you can trust and feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I think we're doing the same. I mean, we're keeping them. I'm pessimistic over 7 years. I'm optimistic over 2 years. But what you said about your finances, I would not encourage taking out a bunch of debt. We're kind of getting out of debt for operating. We're still running, but we're safetying up, I guess. Confident, but safer.
Yeah, and I think the one deal that hasn't been talked about today too, right, is drought recovery. That's going to be one of the single biggest thing that drives this replacement heifer market, is going to be drought recovery here in the West. I think when you were looking at, I think it was Derek's presentation earlier, and we were looking at where the drought map was at last spring, and just those large areas of the West that are still in drought recovery and haven't started to rebuild. Because I go back to an operation like ours, I mean, we're running on, a large extensive footprint, and one of the single biggest things that will drive our ability to grow our cow herd is whether we're in drought or not.
I would say my only comment is, we need more people like you that are going to be optimistic. I spoke with a rancher from Canada last week, and we were talking about their markets and our markets, and how the similarities between them. But I still hear quite a bit. I'm in a different system than out here on the range, being in more row crop country. But these things are worth some money, and people want that money in their pocket. And I think if we're ever going to rebuild, we're going to need to start seeing a little bit more of people holding on to these things. I know Dr. Peel had mentioned, there wasn't really any retention, but we're going to hear more from cattle facts in the morning, but I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a slower creep in that direction. Now, will it be as ramped up as the last cattle cycle? Probably not.
Any parting comments from folks? Okay, well, go ahead, Karen.
I'll just repeat something I heard from Joe Goggins, and it's a great time to get everybody's house in order, and I think a lot of us have already started doing that, and I haven't as much as I should have, but it's good advice, and I think the more we can do that when the times are good, the better we'll be set up for when the times aren't so good.
Yeah, not to pump our CAP team yet again, but we got a program called Know Your Numbers, Know Your Options, and that's what comes to mind when I hear people talk about all these different things. Just take time to keep track of stuff and know what you're doing, and you can do some great work. Let's thank our panelists for answering the questions and giving us their perspective. We really appreciate that. And thank you all of you that asked questions in the audience. That really helped. And I'm going to turn it over to somebody who has some really good news, right? That's what you told me.
That's right. I have wonderful news. Morning session has concluded and lunch is being served in the hallway. So please serve yourselves and then come back and eat here, okay? Well, we'll see you all in the afternoon. Thank you.